Hello and welcome to another US edition of Spectator TV. First up, let me tell you about this year's special Christmas offer for the Spectator's American edition. For $52, that's just $1 a week, you'll get a full subscription to the Spectator's 88-page classy monthly American magazine, plus full access to our brilliant American website. We'll even throw in a free fancy Parker pen so you can scribble your objections straight onto the pages. Just go to spectator.us/Christmas to subscribe. That's spectator.us/Christmas to subscribe. Now, on to the show. I'm joined by Stephen Walt, Professor of International Affairs at Harvard and author of The Hell of Good Intentions, American Foreign Policy Elite and the Decline of US Primacy. Bill Barnard, a historian and former president of Democrats Abroad UK, and the Spectator's Team USA, our Washington editor, Amber Athey, who will just join us in a few moments, and Freddie Gray, our US editor. Now, just about everybody beyond the Oval Office and the nether regions of social media now accepts that Joe Biden will be the 46th president of the United States. And today we'll discuss what a Biden presidency might look like. Of course, Mr. Trump has yet to concede, and his various legal teams still insist that they've got reams of damning evidence showing widespread electoral fraud. The problem is that what they have has been thrown out in court when they've gone there, and a lot of it hasn't even been presented to court. Within days, the Electoral College will vote, and barring some extraordinary reversal, Joe Biden will be formally confirmed as America's 46th president. But before we get to him, let's start by asking all of you how you think the Trump presidency ends. First of all, to you, Stephen, will Mr. Trump disappear after the Biden inauguration? Or is this refusal to concede so far, is it designed to set him up for another run in 2024?
I think it's certainly designed to leave the option open if that seems like an attractive possibility to him. One of the things we've learned about Donald Trump really throughout his entire career is he craves attention. He devotes enormous amounts of effort to trying to get it. And in a sense, marketing his brand has been more important to him than actually running an effective business or running an effective White House. So I don't see him heading off to retirement to play golf and remaining silent. He still has, millions of Twitter followers. I suspect that Twitter feed will remain active. And even if he is busy fighting off various legal actions, he is not going to disappear from the public consciousness, at least not for a while. The most interesting question to me is how the rest of the Republican Party is going to react, because there are a number of other people, Secretary of State Pompeo, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, and possibly Nikki Haley, who would like to consider running in 2024, and they may not want Donald Trump lurking out there as a possibility. That'll be very interesting to watch.
It certainly will. I'm going to come on to what it might mean for the Republican Party. Let me go to Bill now, though. But do you see any kind of strategy in what Mr. Trump is doing at the moment for the future?
I think it probably has more to do with his psychological makeup than any long-term political strategy. He may very well, and I think he does, I entirely agree, that he does want to keep open the possibility. But he's no longer going to be the president of the United States, so his tweets will not command the airwaves in the evening. He won't be able to set the press agenda day by day as he has done over the last 4 years.
Amber, would the Republican establishment, would it welcome another Trump run in 2024, or would that be their worst nightmare?
Well, I think ultimately they would probably have no choice but to welcome it, because they, of course, were originally very against the idea of Trump in 2015 when he started running in that primary, but ultimately were forced to accept him, and he ended up bringing on a lot of the Republican establishment to his side because, of course, they wanted to be able to use his presidency to advance their own agenda. If he were to run again in 2024, I think they would likely do the same thing, although the acceptance would come much quicker, because it would look ultimately very, very bad for the Republican Party if they were to shun a former president who was very, very popular among the party's voters.
Freddie, I mean, lots of things can happen, but it could be, with a fair wind, Mr. Trump in the Republican primaries could be quite hard to beat again, could he not? I mean, if you're Mark Rubio or some of the other ones thinking of having another run, you don't really want him to be there, do you?
Well, I think he's unstoppable if he wants to run it. And I'd even go further and say in 4 years' time, after 4 years of Joe Biden, he might be unstoppable as a presidential candidate for the White House again. Because his specialty is negative campaigning, saying that the system is broken. And one of the reasons I think he failed, as he seems to have done this time, is because he wasn't very good at saying, I've fixed the system, you just need to let me stop the establishment again. So I think he will be a very, very formidable candidate. I think the thing that's going against him now is how long is he going to carry on this, what at the moment looks like an embarrassing charade of contesting this election, and how much do voters find? Obviously, the people who voted for him feel robbed. We can see that. But how much do, let's say if there is a middle ground in America, how much does the middle ground in America think, come on, this election's done, we've got to move on? I think that will be the one thing that will stop him in 4 years' time, is if he really embarrasses himself over this.
Stephen, even if it's not Mr. Trump, he has changed the Republican Party. It's a different Republican Party. He's maybe moving in his direction to some extent, but he's certainly increased it. So, it's not the Republican Party of the country clubs anymore. It isn't even the kind of Reagan West Coast free market limited government Republican Party anymore. Whoever wants to be the next Republican presidential candidate will need to appeal to quite a lot of the Trump base now, will they not?
Well, they'll certainly have to try, but this is going to be the interesting challenge the Republican Party faces. I mean, first of all, I think what it's shown you is, at least at the upper reaches of the party, there's not an enormous amount of principle any longer. These are people who said, horrible things about Trump in 2016, how unqualified he was, how his character was fully deficient. And once he became president, they became acolytes for Trump. I could easily see the Mitch McConnells and Lindsey Grahams turning away from Trump if they didn't think he commanded the same magic any longer. So at the upper reaches of the party, I think it's actually quite flexible. The other thing you have to remember is, Donald Trump got a lower percentage of the popular vote than Mitt Romney did in both his elections, both in 2016 and in 2020, which suggests that although, yes, he's got the Republican Party, he does not have a lock on getting reelected. Right? And a lot of this will depend on exactly what the Biden administration is able to do. If they are able to oversee the effective rollout of a vaccine, and if the American economy then recovers relatively briskly, as is fairly likely, once a vaccine is fully deployed, they're going to get enormous credit for that. And Trump will try to claim that, he did the vaccine, he invented it himself, he cooked it up in the Oval Office, etc. But that's not going to be the way it gets said. Biden will get enormous credit if he does that. And that may put the Republican Party in a very difficult bind. Do we essentially hitch our wagon to going back to what we did from 2016 to 2020, which cost us the White House, or do we try to repackage the party with a younger candidate, a fresher face, and a slightly different message? The other thing to remember is that the Republican base is not getting bigger and it's not getting younger. And the Republicans are eventually going to have to figure out how they appeal to a broader coalition than just this very energized base.
Bill, will Mr. Biden feel that it's one of his roles as president to win back the blue-collar workers to the Democratic stable? The blue-collar workers, particularly in the rural areas and in the smaller towns of the Rust Belt, the Midwest. Will he see that as one of the main aims that he has to achieve?
I think psychologically for him, that's an important thing certainly to try. There was relatively little, but there was some evidence in the returns this time that was working, but not overwhelmingly so by any means. So it'll be very difficult, I think. I think to your earlier question about 2024 and would he prevail against multiple candidates? If there are multiple candidates, if there's a baker's dozen, as there was last time, then Trump is virtually unstoppable because he will retain that hard core of support. If, as happened in the Democratic primary this past time, the Republicans fairly quickly narrow down to one or two candidates, I think it would be more difficult to him. And as far as the Republican Party turning on popular former president. That's occurred before in 2012 with TR, when Teddy Roosevelt was unable to get the Republican nomination in 2012 and ran as a bull mooser.
I did, and heralded in an 8-year Democratic presidency as a result by splitting the vote. And there hadn't been a Democrat in the White House, I think, for quite some time until Mr. Wilson took over. A British Prime Minister once said that a week is a long time in politics. So 4 years is a lot longer than a week, Amber. I mean, all sorts of things could happen. I mean, is there not a risk that Mr. Trump could now be so tied up in all sorts of litigation that he'd just be unable to run?
There's a lot that can happen in 4 years. I mean, if you look back at the 2012 election, for example, no one ever thought that Trump would have been the go-to candidate in 2016. The idea of it was pretty unfathomable. And then we also have these stories that are coming out suggesting that Trump's going to start his own news channel or perhaps buy out Newsmax and create something like Trump TV in order to keep himself in the spotlight for the next 4 years. So I think anything can really happen, and making too many predictions 4 years down the line in politics is a very dangerous game.
Indeed, and Chris Ruddy at Newsmax is Mr. Trump's close friend. They're mates at Mar-a-Lago Club, where they often meet for dinner, so who knows what kind of deals will be done. Be interesting to see where Mr. Trump will get the money to buy out Newsmax, but that's another matter here. Maybe he just add it to his debt. Seems to be what everybody's doing these days. Freddie, I wonder whether, you know, when you look at the election this year, it wasn't really a watershed election because in the end, Joe Biden was elected a mainstream, long-running Democrat. But you could see 2024 being a watershed. The Democratic Party has to determine what is its future now going through the 2020s, post-Biden, assuming Mr. Biden doesn't run again. I wouldn't entirely rule that out. Wouldn't the Republicans also want to say, look, we need to decide what kind of party we're going to be as well as we go through the 2020s? And you can't really do that if Donald Trump's still hanging around.
Well, I think that's exactly right. You've just got the vanishing centre for both parties. The Democrats are going to have to choose between their base and being an establishment party, and the Republicans are going to have to choose between their base and being an establishment party. And the problem for both of them is that all their votes are on the wings. So I don't really see how they get it wrong. But going back to Trump himself, I mean, I wonder whether the movement that he spawned becomes something else, becomes something more, I mean, you might already think that Trump's too overtly nationalist, perhaps he is, but something more overtly nationalist than even Trump. And particularly if Trump carries on with this slightly embarrassing charade over the election for years, it might become just a sort of niche interest. And then you'll have a more sort of nationalist movement emerging on the right. So I mean, the gist of what I'm saying is the extremes are going to win in the end, I think.
Which way, Amber, forward for the Republican Party before we come on to Mr. Biden and his looming presidency? I mean, it's clear now, certainly this year and in 2016, elections are won and lost in quite a narrow range of states, mainly the Rust Belt, the Midwest. The West is now a Democratic fiefdom. The Northeast is a Democratic fiefdom. The South is still largely Republican, though beginning to fray it more than the edges. But to win an election, it seems you need to win these Rust Belt states. It's why Mr. Biden won this year. It's why Mr. Trump won in 2016. If not Trump, Amber, what candidate, what is the likely Republican candidate that can keep that Trump support in the Rust Belt and still shore up the South?
Yeah, one person who I think is actually very underrated and whose name hasn't really been floated in these discussions is Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who actually did a really good job managing the pandemic in his state, even though he was eviscerated by the media for refusing to do a full-blown lockdown, and really embraces a lot of the tenets of Trumpism. I think ultimately the Republican Party would be making a huge mistake by turning away from that. Although Trump did end up losing the election, he managed to help the Republicans down ballot gain seats in the House when they were expected to lose seats in the House. It looks like they're probably going to hold the Senate, provided everything in Georgia goes well and some right-wingers don't succeed with their idea of boycotting the election.
But
Yeah, I saw that, Amber, just to interrupt you, because I saw there are a number of those on the sort of Trumpian right saying it's all a fraud, to such and said, don't vote in the senatorial election. I mean, what are they on? Have they hit the Christmas sherry early or something?
It certainly seems that way, and you would think if the election was fraudulent, then you probably need to turn out twice the number of votes to prevent the Democrats from stealing it. So, if anything, they should
start filling in the ballots yourself. It was bizarre. So I interrupted you there just to say, you were saying it does look, as things stand at the moment, Republicans, tight race, but still likely to hold on to the Senate. That's when I interrupted.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. And, you know, the Republican Party was ultimately very successful in this election, despite losing the presidency, much more successful than they were expected to be. And that's largely because of the appeal of Trumpism. And Trump lost not because he didn't expand his coalition. It's actually because they failed to turn out white male voters in the Midwest. And that was where he lost a lot of ground. So the Republican Party really should have been making sure to register voters in that demographic. But it is a good sign that Trumpism is appealing to a wide swath of voters, because Trump overperformed with Latinos, he overperformed with black men and women. So this is clearly a winning strategy for the Republican Party. And if they turn back the tide to the sort of libertarian, socially liberal coalition that they had before Trump, I just don't see that being appealing to a large group of voters.
That doesn't get the Rust Belt, does it?
No, it does not.
Stephen, I'll give you the final word on this. So I've got one quick yes or no question for all of you before we move on to Mr. Biden. But Stephen, I just picking up what Amber was saying there, I was quite surprised by how strong Mr. Trump's coattails were. You know, it looks like the Democrats haven't got the Senate, and if they do, it still would be a hell of a struggle. They lost seats in the House. I didn't see that coming. And in state legislatures up and down the country, the Republican brand was still remarkably strong, given what it's been through these past 4 years. So give me a final thought on this, whether Trump, whether the Republicans.
I think it depends on how you want to interpret it, because you could argue that this shows the strength of Trumpism, or you could actually show that what the Republicans managed to do was worry people about what a unified government under a Democratic president would be able to do. You know, painting them as socialists, warning them about the squad, suggesting all sorts of things would happen if somehow they lost the Senate, lost the House. You could also view this as it's a repudiation, though, of Trump. What's quite remarkable here is Trump lost in an election where Republicans did well. And I think that's very much a referendum on this particular president, and to some degree the level of, let's call it, social exhaustion that he's helped bring to the country, where people are just tired of the antics. They don't want the country to swing far to the left, but they're not going to be necessarily all that sorry to see this particular individual leave the White House. And that may be something they want to think about for 2024. He may not be, in fact, the best candidate in 4 years, even if a conservative candidate has a good chance.
Indeed, he may not. As Harold Wilson said, a week is a long time in politics.
That's right.
Let me come to the big question that our viewers around the world want to know. It's the big enchilada, as Mr. Nixon would have called it. And it's this: will Donald Trump attend the inauguration? Freddie?
I'm going to go with yes, that he will. After he will flirt.
This is the yes/no interlude.
He will flirt with not going, but he will eventually go. That would be my prediction. But I've got most things wrong in the Trump era, so I probably shouldn't go.
It's totally a guess, but I would say no.
You'd say no. Interesting. Yeah, I certainly wouldn't rule out no. Stephen?
I'll say yes, and he will attempt to do something at the inauguration to make sure that everyone's talking more about him than about Biden.
He'll launch Trump TV.
Well, he's talking about launching his own candidacy for 2024 in...
And then, all right. Amber?
Yeah, I think there's two possibilities. He either attends and is a perfect gentleman and gives Biden the ceremonial gift that the outgoing president usually gives the incoming president, or he actually hosts a rally during the inauguration and boast a crowd of tens of thousands of people to distract from the Biden inauguration.
But is he going, the question was, Amber, is he going to attend or isn't he?
Right now I say yes.
Yes, all right. So more yeses than no there for Spectator TV reveals exclusively today that Donald Trump will attend the inauguration.
It's remarkable we're even asking the question.
Well, it isn't. I mean, I cannot find, going back into my history, I don't remember an inauguration which was never attended by the outgoing president who was able to attend. Is that correct?
I don't know of an example, no.
I don't either. But you know, the niece of Teddy Roosevelt once said of him that her uncle always wanted to be the bride at the wedding and the corpse at the funeral. He couldn't stand not to be the center of attention. And I think to a significant degree that's probably true of Donald Trump as well.
Yeah, it's true. Well, there were some similarities, though I doubt if Donald Trump had been shot with a bullet 1 inch from his heart as Teddy Roosevelt, well, I doubt if Mr. Trump would have carried on talking for 45 minutes the way the then president did. Right, let's move on to the incoming Biden administration. Stephen, Biden's devoted much of his political career to international affairs. I would say his record's not particularly distinguished. He opposed what you might think was the good Gulf War in 1991. He then voted in favor of the bad Iraq War in 2003. I mean, is there any, given his long interest and involvement in foreign affairs, is there any kind of coherent Biden doctrine?
I don't think you'd give it a Biden doctrine that would stand up to a sort of close logical scrutiny, but there's a series of principles that I think you can tie to Biden fairly easily, and that's also true of all the appointees he's announced so far. This is a very mainstream, very familiar group. No outside-the-box thinking evident among any of them. They like democracy. They like all of our traditional allies. They like the idea of multilateral cooperation, but multilateral cooperation with the United States, as Biden put it, at the head of the table. So they believe in transatlantic ties. They believe in our allies in Asia. They don't like Russia very much, and they're increasingly wary of China. Again, this is nothing surprising. It is very much a team drawn from the center of the American foreign policy establishment, and that is by and large.
But Bill, they must realize, I would have thought, Mr. Biden and the team around him, largely a group, as Stephen said, Stephen there, of what we might call liberal internationalists. They must realize that that it can't just be the status quo ante. Even though a lot of them are Team Obama, it can't just go back to their bill, can it? I mean, they must realize that America's appetite for foreign adventures is close to zero. Mr. Trump realized that, and if they do realize that, then in that sense, the Biden administration is continuity Trump.
Well, I think in one sense you're right. They don't have any great appetite, the American people don't, for foreign adventures at the moment. On the other hand, I agree with Stephen on almost everything he said. It is a traditional group. Tony Blinken comes out of a long experience of liberal internationalism, and so does Joe Biden in his own way. I think that you're right. The world has changed just in the 12 years since Biden became vice president with Obama. It's changed significantly, and many of the institutions which Trump undermined need to be reinforced, but also need to be repurposed to some degree and refashioned. And I think that's clearly on their agenda. In addition, I think the notion of, yes, America as sitting at the head of the table of a group of interested and equally committed countries with similar values is valid as well. I think in approaching China, for example, you're going to find the Biden administration will continue to be rather hawkish in its dealings with China, but it also will tend to approach it with a very different tone and a very different approach. That is, in joint effort with our allies rather than trying to go it alone. That certainly did not work very well under Trump, but I think under Biden, that kind of joint effort with our allies presenting a common front will be more effective.
We are going to come on to China because it is such a big issue. for America and for the Biden administration. But Amber, coming back to the liberal internationalists, I mean, Antony Blinken at State looks pretty certain, well qualified for it. But he supported most of America's Middle East interventions. He's very much the liberal globalist internationalist. This is a dividing line for the Republicans, isn't it? I mean, if this is the way the Biden administration goes, that does allow them to define themselves as something different, and they will think and perhaps hope that they're more with the grain of America's mood today than that kind of liberal internationalism.
Yes, although some members of the Republican Party are still very out of touch with the sentiment among the American people that they're sick of foreign intervention, they don't want nation building, they don't want to be a part of international institutions that sell out the American people, like the World Health Organization, which helped China cover up the COVID-19 outbreak, or the Paris Climate Accords, which repeatedly allowed other countries to get away with breaking its regulations, while the U.S. tried to abide by the strictest of the climate accords. So, but you have Mitch McConnell, when Trump was talking about pulling another 2,000 troops out of Afghanistan the past couple of weeks, writing a letter saying that it would be a huge mistake for Trump to do that and that they need to continue to have troops there. And the establishment still in the Republican Party is very much neoconservative and really interested in foreign intervention. You do have newer members of the party like Josh Hawley that have taken the opposite stance and applauded the president's attempt to get us out of forever wars. But I don't think it's going to be as simple as the Republican Party sees that Biden is being more interventionist and therefore is going to take the opposite tack, because the bottom line is that a lot of these people really do believe in that type of foreign policy.
So actually, rather than being a clear blue water between the Republicans and a Biden administration, I hear what you're saying. It actually could cause divisions in the Republican Party, because some Republicans will actually rather like this kind of Biden foreign policy as opposed to Mr. Trump's more isolationist one. Stephen, you wrote The Hell of Good Intentions about America's foreign policy failings. I mean, I myself always thought the purpose of American military intervention was to teach Americans global geography, but that could be another point.
It didn't work very well.
Does Team Biden, therefore, when you think of the hell of good intentions, and Mr. Biden's a well-intentioned person, does it fill you with dread?
It makes me nervous, although I'm willing to give any new team, their opportunity to prove that they've learned from past mistakes. Certainly the instincts of this team, as I suggested before, are to see the United States as very much a problem-solving country. In fact, Jake Sullivan, the designate for National Security Advisor, wrote an article in The Atlantic a couple of years ago where he argued that that was still the thing that made America exceptional, the idea that our purpose was to do good in the world and to solve problems. So yes, they recognize that there's no great enthusiasm for ambitious social engineering abroad within the American body politic right now. The question is, can they resist temptation when opportunities or crises emerge? And remember, there's going to be a long list of countries lining up to ask the Biden administration for help. Our Middle East country allies are going to want more help against Iran. European allies will want help against Russia. Our Asian allies will want help against China, and everybody's going to want help on climate. And of course, the Biden team is very committed to doing something on climate and has put a former Secretary of State in charge, John Kerry, as special envoy. That's a long list of supplicants lining up at the State Department and White House door. And if they say yes to all of those requests, this is going to be a very, very busy administration indeed.
So and a very expensive administration.
Absolutely. So again, I am hopeful that they have learned from the past, but time will tell.
Freddie, what are your thoughts on the incoming Team Biden, particularly on the foreign policy front?
I'm even more cynical than Stephen is about this. I'm sorry, Stephen wasn't cynical at all. I wish he were more cynical, because I think the swamp is back, but also the cant is back, and you're going to hear a hell of a lot of talk about values. And I've learned over the last 20 years, as a big fan of America, that when Americans start talking about their values in international affairs, it's usually bad news. And you have a lot of this sort of talk in the Biden, the incoming team, people like Jake Sullivan. It's a lot about how, the Black Lives Matter movement is also a foreign policy issue. So they are trying to sort of create this idea of foreign policy as progress and good in the world. And they're going to establish good in the world against evil, which is populism and Trump. And I just think that is fraught with terrible, terrible dangers. And I'm slightly nervous about it. I also thought it was funny that Avril Haines, the new director of intelligence, one of the most powerful people in the country now, promised that she would always speak truth to power. And I thought that's such a cant thing to say. That's such a load of rubbish that you, as director of national intelligence, are going to speak truth to power, because you are power. You're not some radical who's doing good in the world. So I find them very depressing, and I'm worried about what's going to happen in foreign policy.
Well, Stephen, the Sunni leaders in the Gulf they're up to here with the Palestinians now. They are much more frightened of Iran than they are of Israel, which is why they're doing deals with Israel, because they have a common enemy in Iran. Mr. Trump was happy to go along with this. He never questioned the Saudis about the murder and the dismemberment of the journalist. He never pressed the Gulf states to liberalize in any way. He just saw this in hard realpolitik terms, and in a way of getting America even more out of the Middle East as well. I think he took the view, well, we don't really need their oil anymore, so why are we there? This is a difficult one for Mr. Biden, I would suggest, Stephen.
Well, I think it is, and it'll be a great litmus test to see their willingness to, say, depart from conventional policy. I don't expect this administration to devote the same effort to pursuing a two-state solution, which I think is no longer even a possibility, that the Obama administration did, that the Bush administration did, that the Clinton administration did. You could even argue that they have the opportunity for a real reset of American Middle East policy. They've said they'd like to get back to the nuclear agreement with Iran if that turns out to be possible. That certainly would help our relations with Europe, and it would, I think, foreclose the option of an Iranian bomb for some time to come. That won't be popular in Israel, in Saudi Arabia, in Egypt, or the Gulf states. But in a sense, what's already taken place is the United States essentially saying to those countries, we think you can handle your own security problems, and you should stop expecting Washington to protect you. Egypt, Israel, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf states together are substantially stronger than Iran for a variety of reasons, and we'll let our partners in the region do most of the heavy lifting while the United States takes a more detached stance. I think that's an opportunity for the Biden administration, especially if they're really worried about China and they want to focus a lot of their attention on Asia. The other thing that has changed before 2016, but it's now increasingly evident, is the United States is no longer the unipolar power that doesn't face any potential great power rivals. And once you're in a serious geopolitical competition, you have to start setting some priorities. Putting the Middle East on the back burner would be a very smart move by the Biden team, and I'm hoping that's what they do.
But Stephen, even this emphasis that the team Biden has been placing on trying to reinvigorate the Iran nuclear deal, it's possible to say, look, that's old politics as well. It is not the prospect of a nuclear bomb that really terrifies the Israelis. They'd rather Iran didn't have it. But they've got over 300, the Israelis. They know the Iranians are still rational. They may be Ayatollahs, but they're rational. One Iranian bomb on Israel and Iran would cease to exist. That's what the Israelis would do, and they have the firepower and the nuclear arsenal to do that. What worries them, what worries the Saudis, because they've been used against the Saudi oil fields, are the high-precision Iranian missiles, the very state of the art. They work, they got under cover of Saudi and American radar. The Hezbollah has thousands and thousands of them. That's the problem, and I suggest that's what the Biden administration will have to come to terms with.
Actually, I'd put it slightly differently. I don't think it's actually the Iranian capabilities, which Iran used, of course, to point out to the world that the maximum pressure campaign imposed by the Trump administration wasn't going to sort of lead them to lower their tents and surrender. I think the thing that really does worry the regional powers is Iran getting out of the penalty box. In a sense, Iran has been placed in a position of economic and geopolitical isolation over the last 20 or 30 years. And the Iran nuclear deal was the first step towards Iran essentially rejoining the international community, becoming a normal country along with everybody else. And I think that's what really worries the Saudis, the Israelis, because once Iran is able to regain full engagement with the international community and the world economy, it does have enormous latent power potential. So 20, 30 years down the road, it might be a formidable adversary for those countries, even if it isn't right now.
Let's turn to Mr. Biden's approach to China. Now, he's perceived by many to be weak on China. He said some things about it that he doesn't like being quoted back to him now. But his team, and even across the Democratic aisle in Congress, they're much more hawkish than Mr. Biden does. Amber, how will that work out?
I just think it's difficult to trust the Biden administration on China because of how wishy-washy he's really been about the whole situation. He literally launched his campaign by saying that China was not going to eat the U.S.'s lunch, and that the idea that Trump was trying to hold them accountable for terrible trade deals and intellectual property theft was basically a joke. And then he has his own son, Hunter, on the board of a state-owned Chinese company, and he was not actually removed from that board until well into the general election. I believe it was actually the final month of 2019 that Hunter Biden was actually removed from that board, supposedly. And then you have the fact that Biden was really open to the idea of American cooperation with China earlier in his political career. He voted to normalize trade relations with China, which was one of the main things that allowed China to start taking advantage of the American economy and outsourcing jobs. So the idea that Biden is somehow now going to be the ultimate hawk on China, I think, is really hard to believe.
Bill, the people talk about the differences between a Biden administration and a Trump one on foreign policy, even on China. But I'm wondering whether there seems to me to be quite a DC consensus on China now, which is be tough with China. We've been too soft in the past. The Obama administration was too soft. Trump may have been rather brutal, vulgar in the way he dealt with China, but he moved to the right position, and the Biden administration will continue that toughness. Do you think that's true?
I think that it will take a relatively tough line towards China, but our relationship with China is and will be a rather complex one. There are certain areas in which we're going to be competitive. There are other areas where we need cooperation and collaboration. So we have to be able to work on those different tracks. And I think the Biden administration will prove able to do that. There's no greater China hawk than Chuck Schumer, for example. And that feeling that the Chinese have taken advantage, particularly of intellectual property and other measures in dealing with trade, that they are taking a reckless course in geopolitical considerations in the South Pacific. All of that is true, and we're very much aware of that. We have to be on guard against that, but we can deal with it in a way that isn't flaunting ourselves towards them. It isn't insulting to them, and we can do it in harmony with our allies. I think in retrospect, one of the great mistakes of the recent past will be our turning away from TPP, for example, where we were trying to set the terms of trade and establish a kind of rule of law and a common understanding for trade in the whole of the Pacific, minus China. We rejected it. It went ahead anyway. There will be some way or another that we can come to terms with that and become active once more and try to counter the moves that China has made in trade and in geopolitical terms and in military terms, for that matter, in that area. So I think you'll continue to see a strong and forceful engagement with China, but one that seeks cooperation and collaboration where we can on those issues like climate change, that where we have to work together. And yet on other issues, there will be a relative degree of firmness. I don't think there's a kind of blanket approach to China that will work, as Amber suggests.
I'm interested that you mentioned the Trans-Pacific Partnership, because other than just wanting to show he was kind of against free trade or free trade deals, I was always puzzled by Mr. Trump just pulling out of that, because it was the potential alliance of America's allies, of countries, most of them democracies, all worried about China, all wanting America's presence in the Eastern Pacific as a counterweight, prepared to be America's allies. It was a trade organization, but it would have led to much more. Countries, unlike a lot of America's European allies, prepared to spend money on defense, prepared to spend a lot of money on defense. When you think of all that, would it not make sense for a Biden administration, with its belief in alliances as well and friends, to revive that, to join it again?
In some terms, we've moved beyond that. They've moved beyond that in a way. I'm not an expert, again, on that part of the world, but nonetheless, I do think that, yes, that would be a reasonable thing to pursue. There will be problems within the Democratic Party that he'll face to do so, but presidents in the past, Democratic presidents, for example, Bill Clinton, have faced those in the past and have dealt with them. So I think, yes, that might very well prove to be something that he could do. They would want, I think, to present it in a way that there's some change that makes it better, that makes it different from what it was, but nonetheless, I think that's a real prospect.
Well, you better look out, because Britain might join that Trans-Pacific Partnership before America does. There's a lot of talk in London that that's the quick way to do 10, 11 free trade deals right away. Just join that, and it's a part of the world the British know very well and still have a presence in, and so on. I was interested, Freddie, I thought the Wall Street Journal said yesterday that China's only friend in America now is Wall Street, which I thought was a great line, but is it true?
It is a great line. I think there is a bit of truth to it. It's still quite a good friend to have, though, clearly. It's not...
Well, of course, Wall Street's quite friendly to Mr. Biden as well, particularly now he hasn't appointed Elizabeth Warren as Treasury Secretary.
Well, I think going back to something Stephen and Bill were saying, I think one of the interesting things about the Trump presidency and foreign policy is that he got rid of all these embarrassing things that America needed to say out loud, like they needed to say to China, our trading relationship is not reciprocal, you've been taking advantage of us for ages. There have been grumblings about that for ages in America, but it wasn't sort of government policy to do anything about it. Ditto NATO. You have grumblings about other NATO members not doing their fair share. Trump comes out and says it in his brusque, vulgar way and makes everybody feel very uncomfortable. But I think the opportunity for the Biden administration now is they can take the fact that Trump has moved that conversation on, and they can now say, well, that is our starting position, and we don't have to be aggressive and feel like we're winding you up about it. But yes, we do expect you to be reciprocal in your trading relationships, or yes, with NATO, you do have to pay your fair share. So I think Trump has been beneficial in a foreign policy sense there.
Amber, I was interested when I came on to China, you immediately mentioned. So is Hunter Biden, when we come to talk about American-Chinese policy, is that going to be the equivalent of the Democrats going on and on about Mr. Trump and Russia for months, years after the election? Is this going to be the mirror image of that?
It definitely has the threat of being that way. I think the more Republicans actually hammer that point well after the election, the more people are going to think that it's really just a sore loser tactic. And even when Trump was really running on the idea of the Hunter Biden emails for the last couple of months of the election, it really turned a lot of people off, or people just really weren't that interested in it. So I think Republicans would do well to learn that lesson and probably not focus so much on that point when Biden is dealing with China. I think it does speak to perhaps Biden's friendliness with China, but I don't think it would be right for people to use that well into his administration as an example of, how he's especially going to govern, I think.
Because in the end, the Mueller report concluded that there was no collusion. Russia had certainly tried to interfere in the election, but the really dynamite point were the claim Rachel Maddow and MSNBC and all the rest of them saying it was night after nine that the Trump people had colluded with the Russians. That turned out pretty much not to be true. And I find it hard to believe that Hunter Biden really, in the end, Amber, will have any significant, if I didn't strike the word significant, just any influence on Biden's foreign policy to China, surely.
Right, and I don't think Hunter Biden's deal with China was ever something that was hinting at illegality or corruption, but really just showed more generally the globalist inclinations of the Biden family, because Hunter was profiting a lot from working for a state-run company that, was owned by China. And I think that speaks more to the fact that this neoliberalist regime that Biden is going to be overseeing is one that's perfectly fine with global corporations taking advantage of America and really powerful people profiting from them.
It was good of Biden to. Sorry, it was good of Biden to clarify that Hunter will not have a role, a government role in the administration. I think that was a smart move on his part.
So he's not going to be the Ivanka of the Biden administration.
No.
Stephen, I can just trying to look strategically at the Biden foreign policy. I can see where he's going to be more multilateral. He's going to try and reinvigorate America's relations with its allies and so on. He's going to try and bring America, what he will see, back into the mainstream of Western foreign policy again. I get all that. But it does turn out that Trump was a watershed on US global policy. No more unvarnished free trade. Mr. Biden, I doubt, is going to change that very much. The Europeans need to do more for themselves. And Europe is no longer as important as it was anyway to America. Mr. Biden's team probably agrees with that. The pivot to the Pacific, starting with Mr. Obama, has continued, will continue under Mr. Biden. A tougher line with China, which seems to be the new default position in Washington. So when you add all that up, things will be done in a different way. There'll be a different tone. There'll be different emphasis. But strategically, will there be much of a change?
This is a great question. There's always this tendency to believe that presidents as individuals are going to have enormous impact. That's why you focus on, what did Biden vote on when he was in the Senate, or what did his son have business dealings. If you're thinking about China, for example, you're talking about a country with an economy as large as ours. This is a major great power competitor. And the idea that this is going to be determined by Hunter Biden's business relationships, or for that matter, by the fact that Ivanka Trump wanted to do some business deals in China too, I think is sort of preposterous. This is going to be, I think, is something that the Biden administration takes very, very seriously. There is going to be a considerable amount of continuity, more than people might think, because some of Trump's instincts on foreign policy were exactly right. Europe needed to be less dependent on the United States. By the way, that's something every American president has complained about since Dwight D. Eisenhower, at least. Certainly that hyper-globalization as it was being pursued was not a good idea, and that needed to be revised. And, if Joe Biden wants to join TPP, he's going to have to face down the Bernie Sanders wing of the Democratic Party. It might make sense to do it from a strategic point of view. I would support it for that reason, but it's not going to be an easy sell. I think the biggest thing to remember, though, is that style to some degree does matter. And Trump's style was counterproductive, right? He tried to go up against China on trade all by himself. Right? He didn't get Japan on his side. He didn't get South Korea on his side. He didn't get the European Union on his side when he confronted China on trade, and therefore he didn't get very much. China didn't alter its trading practices despite all the pressure he was under. And the one final point I'll make here is the election. This takes us back to where we started. The election showed that the country is still somewhat polarized. And that's a problem for the conduct of foreign policy, because when Biden goes out and tries to reach agreements with other countries, tries to get them to make adjustments, makes promises to them of if you do this, we'll do that, other countries have to worry that in 4 years, Donald Trump comes back, somebody from the other side comes back and starts to unwind everything that was done. In other words, the pendulum keeps swinging back and forth. And so, in a sense, for American credibility, it would be better if we were more unified. Biden has said he wants to do that, but I think that's going to be a very heavy lift for him.
To what extent do you think it is possible with China to get other allies to sort of publicly stand in opposition to what China is doing? I mean, we saw in Britain, it took a lot of pressure from the Trump administration to get any sort of move on Huawei, the tech giant, and we eventually backed down on our commitment to doing 5G. But that took incredible pressure from the US to do that. I just wonder, particularly regional allies against China, let's say, how easy is it for America to get them on side, publicly on side, so that they are seen to be in opposition to China?
There is a trade-off between the economic relations that many of these countries want to preserve with China and their growing concerns about China's power. Here, the United States has one asset, and that's been the fact that Chinese diplomacy over the past 5 years has become increasingly malevolent. The so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, which seems to regard insulting other countries as the way to make friends and build influence. The fact that China has punished Australia for asking for an independent inquiry into the origins of the coronavirus, etc. All of these things have made it easier for the United States to make the case that other countries in Europe and Asia have to be increasingly concerned about China's growing power, possibly China's growing ambitions. So I think the conditions are there to pull a lot of countries together. And in fact, the response to 5G, to the American effort to control Huawei in various ways, is encouraging, as is the European Union's recent decision report calling for greater cooperation across the Atlantic on digital technology and digital governance, all of it clearly inspired by concerns about China. So I think the ingredients are there for a multilateral response to China. Whether they can pull that off is, again, one of the things that's going to be on their, I think, very high on their to-do list.
Well,
Andrew,
the Spectator.
Can I pick up on one? Can I pick up on one point?
Yeah, Bill, sure.
Point that Stephen made.
I just want to get on to Brexit as a final.
I've been here for roughly 30 years, and I notice every 4 years or 8 years when there's a new president, there's a British historian or a professor of international relations who comes out with a book pointing out the continuity between, even though there's been a change in administration and even a change in parties. But that's perfectly understandable. The personalities change, the tone changes, and tone makes a great deal of difference. But the strategic interests of the United States do not change. And insofar as one president is accurately reflecting and channeling the strategic interests of the United States, the other one's policy is going to bear some similarity. So I think that's an understandable phenomenon.
It is indeed, because it's strategic, and in post-war American history, there has, most of the time, there's been a consensus on America's strategic industries across the aisle there of the bulk of both of the major parties. Spectator is doing its bit, standing by Australia against China at the moment. We're drinking as much Australian wine as we can get our hands on. There's plenty of it at the various supermarkets across the UK. Let's finish with Mr. Biden's approach to Brexit. We don't need to spend too much time on it. Mr. Biden was against it, as was the whole US foreign policy establishment. Team Biden was against it, but it will have happened by the time he is inaugurated. So what can he do, Amber?
Well, it seems like not much. He's going to have to grin and bear it. Much like the troop withdrawal from Afghanistan, Biden has signaled tepid support for that idea. Much the same will happen with Brexit. He'll smile and nod, and internally, the establishment will be very upset about it, but they will have no choice if they want to continue their good relationship with the UK for them to go along with what's happening.
You see, Stephen, here's the deal, as Mr. Biden likes to say. He might not like Brexit. Well, he doesn't like Brexit. He might not like Boris Johnson. A lot of Team Biden think there's a kind of Trumpian element to Boris Johnson. There isn't, but that's what they think. He will want to deal more with the EU, and of course there are fences to be mended there after the Trump years. There's no question about that. But if you look at every one of Mr. Biden's strategic foreign policy goals, coming back to strategic, as Bill was saying, rebuilding the Atlantic Alliance. You need Britain to do that. We're the second most important member of that alliance. Free trade, we are the biggest voice in favor of free trade in the global economy. Re-entering the Paris climate agenda, we're there. We're hosting the big conference next year in Glasgow. Getting European allies more interested in the Pacific. You mentioned that too, they had to do that. Britain is the only country with the military resource to be able to help deployment in the Pacific with 2 world-class aircraft carriers, and Australia is a close ally providing perimeter protection there. So my point, is rather long-winded point to you, Stephen, is that he may not like it, he may be worried about the Good Friday Agreement, all the rest of it. Britain is an essential part, sometimes the essential part, of a lot of his strategic foreign policy goals. Stephen.
It's nice that you think that Britain is that important, but I think that may not be quite correct. And here I'll actually echo this idea of continuity. I think, Boris Johnson was under the illusion that after Brexit, he was going to go get a great trade deal from his good friend, Donald Trump. And what he didn't realize was that Americans, regardless of party, are really quite ruthless bargainers most of the time. And Britain was not going to be as important economically to the United States as the whole European Union is, and therefore Britain wasn't going to get a good deal from the Trump administration. Britain's not going to get any special treatment, it seems to me, from the Biden administration as well.
No,
we're not
that wasn't what
want...
I was saying, Stephen. No, that's not what I was saying. I didn't say that we'd get a free trade deal. I mean, my own view is there won't be one, though I would suggest to you that a UK-US trade deal would be a lot easier than a US-EU trade deal. I mean, Mr. Biden is unlikely to live long enough to see a US-EU trade deal. That'll take about 7, 8, 9 years. We could do one a year, but I wasn't arguing about that because I don't think I don't think it'll happen. I'm not sure it matters all that much anyway. We run a massive balance of payments surplus with America. Why would we want to screw that up? You're the one with the deficit. My point was that on his foreign policy goals, let's just take the Atlantic Alliance. There is no way you can breathe new life into the Atlantic Alliance without involving Britain at the center of that strategy.
Right. No, my only point is that, in a sense, you're right. He will accept Brexit because Brexit is a done deal, but it's not going to be suddenly return to the halcyon days of the special transatlantic relationship. And in some respects, Britain's value to the United States has gone down somewhat by Brexit, because in the old days, Britain was kind of a nice bridge for us into Europe, because Britain was part of NATO, but also part of the European Union. Now that you left the European Union, the flight can go straight to Brussels without having to go through London, and we don't need London's influence in the Union to try and advance American interests.
When you get to Brussels, who do you talk to?
We talk to the Europeans. Who do we talk to when we go to the UK?
And on defense, who do you talk to on defense with the Europeans?
I have a slightly different view from Stephen in that I think
I was enjoying the silence there from Stephen for a minute. On you go, Bill.
I think the underlying military and security connections between the two countries will remain very strong and very important. They're part of the Five Eyes. There's no replacement for that, really. That all will continue. I do agree with Stephen that to some degree, the closeness of the relationship with Great Britain, with the United Kingdom, as a bridge to the EU, that disappears, and that there will be less traffic on that bridge than there used to be. But nonetheless, I do think that underlying alignment of interest and strategic interest and values will remain strong and exceedingly important for the United States.
No, I don't want to over-egg Britain's importance in this at all. And in many areas, it will be either of no importance or peripheral importance. The Pacific being one area. It may have a contribution, but it will be a peripheral contribution. Understand that. I was just going through Mr. Biden's goals, and in every strategic goals, and in every one, Britain would be one of the key allies that he will have. Not the only one, but a key. But anyway, let me come on to the final thing. Freddie, the UK media sometimes it paints Mr. Biden as anti-British. And I think that's probably got more to do with Brexit and the Good Friday Agreement and his Irish ancestors and so on. But I'd point out that during the Falklands War, there was no stauncher supporter of Britain on Capitol Hill than Senator Joe Biden. I don't think he's right to be concerned about the Good Friday Agreement. I've got no problem with that. But I don't think he's anti-British. Do you, Freddie?
No, I don't. I do think among Team Biden there is a sort of reflexive sense that, as you mentioned earlier, they think Brexit and Boris are a bit Trumpy. And so they're a bit suspicious of it. I mean, Blinken has said numerous things that sort of sound a lot like what you hear from very sort of ardent Remainers in Britain, which is, these idiot Brits don't really know what they're doing. They've gone and cocked up the whole system. And so I think there is this sort of sense that Brexit is wrong. And even if their strategic interests are more aligned with Brexit, or prove to be more aligned with Brexit, or mean that America should not have some sort of prejudice against Brexit Britain, I think the desire to signal their objections and to show that they care a lot about the Good Friday Agreement may end up overwhelming and causing tensions in the next couple of years, quite significant tensions, I fear.
Well, if there's no deal, that will be doubly true. If there is a deal, the Good Friday Agreement will still be pretty much intact. So it won't be such a big issue. We're going to leave it there. Listen, I want to thank you all of my guests for joining us, for giving us your time. It's been a joy to have you. It's been great to get your time and your expertise and insight. And I know this is a busy time of the week, so I want to thank you for that. Don't forget, those of you watching, to take full advantage of the special Christmas offer for the Spectator's American edition, $52. That's just $1 a week, and you get a full subscription for a year to the Spectator's 88-page monthly American magazine, which looks lovely, and full access to our brilliant American website, updated hour by hour by hour with great writing, even some humor, which you don't often see in American political magazines. We'll even throw in a free Parker pen so you can subscribe and scribble down your objections to what we're saying straight onto the pages and then send it to us. Go to spectator.us/Christmas, spectator.us/Christmas in order to subscribe. Now, if you're starved for more American coverage, Freddie has his own podcast, Americano, which is a must listen. You'll find it, all your podcasts there at spectator.co.uk/Americano. But from all of us here at Spectator TV, that's it for now. Thank you for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.